Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Financial Rebellion. Carolyn is back in Ohio. I'm in Pennsylvania, and we have a very special show for you today. We're going to be talking about pharma food with Elze van Hamelen, who is one of the leading journalists in the Netherlands. She's coming to us live from the middle Netherlands. I live in the north of the Netherlands. And Elze had a very successful career in the corporate sustainability world and realized, something's very wrong. And she transitioned to journalism and has been doing an extraordinary job, among other things, covering food. And she's written 2 blockbuster reports. The first is Pharma Food. The second is the Dutch Farmers and Fishermen, which we'll also be talking today. We published it as a subscriber-only wrap-up in the Solari report, but we've been trying to also get the message out. I constantly tell people, we thought, Elze, when we published this, that it would not be a popular topic and wrap-up. And when we were in the Weston Price Conference in Kansas City and then in Savannah with CHD, both Carolyn and I were there, what we discovered is the fresh food people who are trying to talk their families into friends into going local with fresh food said it's the best marketing device they've ever had. Anyway,
people were buying packs of them.
Right. So what is pharma food? Pharma food is a label created by Elze to describe synthetic food, but particularly lab-grown meat. And this is a major in-depth report, many links and a wealth of sort of the best sources to describe what is happening in the creation of synthetic food. Elze, you may not realize this, but John Kerry, who used to be the climate change czar in the United States, he may still be, said the other day that we needed the farmers to go extinct. And right. So to me, if the farmers go extinct and we lose our local food system, we're all going to be eating pharma food. And it's very important for people to understand the vision of what they have planned for us. So why don't we start by you explaining how you got interested in pharma food, how you got the courage to deep dive this topic and write it, and what you found.
Well, thank you, Catherine. So I write for De Andere Krant, which is a 100% reader-funded independent newspaper in the Netherlands. And I found this little press release that the Dutch government was investing $60 million into cellular agriculture, which is lab-grown meat, or to build an ecosystem. So my editor-in-chief said, yeah, you can write something about that. And I started reading. And I got so many questions. So my last assignment as a sustainability consultant was for a biotech company. So I was very familiar with the production process of a biotech medicine and also how difficult and expensive it is. And so they were saying they were going to produce a product with the margin of a hamburger with a production process of a biotech medicine. So I thought, if you get the capital and if you get all this, you get the people who are educated to do this, you train the people on the work floor. Why would you do this? It just didn't make sense. And I was kind of concerned that I thought, why are they using a production process for biotech medicines and sell it to us as food? That was weird as well. So I had like 3 pages of questions, and I just had 1 page for a little article. And then I thought somebody should look into this. And I sent my questions to you and to Corey Lynn, because I thought either of you might be able to dive into this. And you asked me can you do a wrap up? And yeah, I just felt so honored that you asked me to do this type of research and to be able to go so wide and so deep into it. So Another very big question was that I thought, okay, they say lab-grown meat, but if I go to the supermarket and I buy a piece of meat, then I cannot grow a cow out of it. So what do they mean when they're growing meat? So that was another question. And that...
So I just want to jump in for a second, because we hit these topics, and this is typical of what we try and do. We hit these topics where you can't tell people the summary unless you've done a deep dive and you've collected all the evidence and you've documented, because it's so bizarre what is going on that it's very difficult for people to fathom it. And so unless you have a grounding in a very serious research effort, you can't do the short, simple article. So one of our hopes was, with this deep dive, that you would then be able to do those simple, short stories, from a position of great strength, because you can always say, okay, well, here are the 20 articles, and here's the research, and here's the science. Okay, so that is why these kinds of studies on something like pharma food is so important. So anyway, I interrupted. Go ahead.
When you look at the money involved, I mean, it's just billions and billions of dollars.
I could not believe the tsunami of money pouring into something that is completely uneconomic, that there is no market for. The market doesn't want this. So, but you are pouring billions and billions of dollars into it. It's extraordinary.
Well, that was weird as well, because these first startups started emerging around 2015, and they really increased during the so-called pandemic years. But if you realize, like, there's one of these companies sells a product at one venue for $70 a dish. So all of these other companies, they're not just not getting any revenues, they're getting no profit, no revenues, and they exist for years. And this is extremely capital intensive. So it really makes you wonder, how is this possible? It just doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective.
But the predictions, if I remember correctly, go to 70 or 80% of the consumption of what they call meat, or in the meat category, over a period of time is supposed. In other words, they're expecting us to come off of natural meat down to being only 20% of our consumption of so-called meat.
So I'm sort of my focus right now is to stop financial transaction control. And I really believe, if you look at the money pouring into this, because one of my favorite sections in Pharma Food that you wrote was, why would a logical person do this? Why would a logical person, what are the possible reasons, which you explore? But my fear is, if they get financial transaction control, then they can mandate that this is what we eat.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and if you see how this...
I'm sorry, put it in the schools, for example.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Everything, schools, everything. Right.
They've already been doing that with insects in the Netherlands.
Right. Putting it in the schools. So could you, I don't know if it's possible to do this quickly, Elze. Can you possibly explain the process by which lab-grown meat is created? That was where I gave up and had to go to sleep.
Okay. Well, you need cells. They use cell lines, and cell lines are widely used in the biotech pharma sector. But what is a cell line? They take some cells from a living organism, because very similar to an organ transplant, you cannot transplant a dead organ. So cells need to be alive, otherwise you can't culture them. And if you culture living cells, you need to take biopsies from a living animal. So they say it's all pain-free and so on, but you still need the living animal. However, those primary cells taken from a living animal, you cannot culture them very well. So you need to manipulate them in some kind of way that they will grow very fast, and you get a consistent result. And how do you manipulate them? Either they are kind of like spontaneously cancerous, because they need to proliferate very quickly. So what are cells that proliferate quickly? either cancers or fetuses. They have cells that proliferate very quickly. So these cell lines are usually made from, well, the classic cell lines in biotech pharma, from fetal cells. And if you start looking into what kind of cell lines do they use for the lab grown meat, they are very opaque about it. So some will say we use primary cells, but if you look at the science, you know they can never go to a high scale production with primary cells. And then there was another article that said, well, the cell lines are really the secret sauce of this whole lab grown meat sector. Because the first animal cell line, cow cell line, was produced in 2018. And then already for 3 years, companies were working on this. But what were they working with when they don't have an animal cell line? Some research agencies said, well, we use existing mouse or hamster cell lines. But if you're going to be honest about that, you're using that for the food, then people might be neophobic. Neophobic is fear of novel foods. So anyway, so they have a cell line. It's kind of unclear what kind of cells they use, but then these cells need to grow. Normal cells, they are in a structure in your body, but a bioreactor doesn't have a structure. So it's grown in a very thin film, or it needs to grow in a growth medium, which in your body is your blood. But your blood is a very complex kind of substance that contains hormones and amino acids, and I don't know, it has a lot of stuff in it that supports the cells and feeds the cells and nourishes the cells. So then they need to develop a good medium. Apparently what is used often, because it works so well, better than the synthetic stuff, they use fetal bovine serum, which is blood that is tapped from living cow fetuses. And there's a market for this. So, and it's really gruesome how they explain how this is harvested. So then that kind of, because they say the whole lab grown meat is animal friendly, and if you are tapping blood from live fetuses, then that kind of like does away with your narrative. So then they try to develop alternatives, but then you need to develop synthetic blood. So they use precision fermentation, which is genetically modified microbes, and artificial hormones, which in the EU is a problem because you're not allowed to add that to food. Then you need to source all these minerals and micronutrients and macronutrients, and it becomes insanely expensive. So that again makes you wonder, how are they?
One of the things you described while you're describing all of these different ingredients and getting them to work properly in the proper sequence is how essential it was to keep everything sterile in the manufacturing process, and how extraordinarily expensive it was to train people to function in that environment and to keep it essentially clean. And so the expense, not just of what you're describing, but also of the whole plant environment, is fantastically expensive.
You need clean rooms. So clean rooms are spaces where they absolutely control the room for contaminations into parts per billion. Because as soon as there is a contamination in this brew, then it becomes ridden with bacteria, and you don't have a cell culture, you have a bacteria culture, and you can throw it all away, all these expensive resources. So you need a very clean environment, but if your personnel is not well trained, then that will create enormous issues, because your product process will just not work. And then there's the other part. So in your body, you have all these vessels that give nutrients to your cells, and they get rid of toxins. But the brew doesn't have a vessel system. So this cell culture also starts to generate toxins, and there's no way to get rid of them. And they also don't have an answer in their production process of how they get rid of the toxins that are being produced during the cell cultures. So after pharma food came out, there was an article in Wired magazine, and there were a couple of employees from Upside Foods, which is a lab-grown meat startup. And they said, well, is Upside Foods the next Terranos? Because we say everything is working so wonderfully. And they said they have complete issues with growing the batches, with the contamination, with all the things that were signaled in the Pharma Food report. But these are employees working at the company that confirm what was said by a number of scientists, that you cannot take this kind of process to large scale production. And if you see how it is produced and the amount of like synthetic toxic materials that are being added to it, you really makes you want, like, this is toxic to eat. And they are really focused on the scientific part of developing this product, but there's no human testing. And because it's not a official pharmaceutical product, they don't need to do lab studies of how people respond to this. So if this is brought to market, it's also really, again, an open air human experiment.
So one of the questions I had, if you go back to the interview or the video that Ulrich Groniger did called Wave Genome, she describes the experiments of Pop, the German scientist, that was able to show that essentially the vitality and sort of electromagnetic nature of an organic egg was totally different than a non-organic egg. In other words, it's not just the chemistry. There's also an electromagnetic, I would describe it as electromagnetic. I don't know if that's the proper term, but there is a vitality issue that is not just captured by the chemistry. And when you read Pharma Food and you listen to the whole effort they're doing and the buildings they're building, because I see buildings coming up all over the Netherlands to do this. There's, they're working in a wholly material paradigm where that vitality issue doesn't exist. It's just pure chemistry. So it's almost like food happens in two dimensions and they're only dealing with one dimension. That's poisonous, but the thing that frightens me is the absence of that other dimension could be devastating to human health. Does that make sense?
Definitely. So there are actually a couple of people in the Netherlands that experiment with this, with testing the vitality of food, but it's not really recognized by science. But they have very interesting, like they use Steiner methods to test the vitality of food, and you see very clear differences between the Steiner method food, regular organic food, the kind of soil that it's grown on, and if it's a GMO. There are very clear differences. Something that I was worried about, that's not in the report in that much depth, is each time I ran into this experimentation of microbes, and it's covered in the report, but there's also, so they use microbes. So regular fermentation we use to make wine, for example. You have the bacteria and they eat the sugars in the grapes and it's turned into alcohol. So regular fermentation is a very old and common process, and that you also use to like sauerkraut to keep food for a longer time. But what they do with the synthetic, so SynBio or precision fermentation, is that you have a microbe like an E. coli bacteria, and they insert the gene that codes for example, human milk, or a gene that codes for wood, or for cow milk, or for fat. And they insert that in the bacteria, and then the bacteria starts to produce that. And then again, they give the feed, the microbe stuff, and instead of producing wine, they start producing some sort of synthetic substance. But there's just as big investment push also from DOD and DARPA for this kind of, and Bill Gates and Jingo Bio for this type of precision fermentation for in foods, but also a lot of other different kind of substances in the economy. And our health system is dependent on a very diverse microbiome. And this microbiome, like if you buy fresh vegetables from organic vegetables, the soil has a microbiome, the cow has a microbiome, and all these microbes are connected. And I believe this diversity gives you a large part of your health. Like you mentioned the Western Price Conference. In the Western Price diets, there's a lot of fermented food. That's part of people all over the world in original diets. So because of our hyper processed diets, our own microbiome is already very much depleted and not biodiverse anymore. And now you're going to add synthetic bacteria to this.
Right.
What is that going to do with it? And then I ran into some articles that said, well, we actually noticed that people who have some mental disturbances, their microbiome is disturbed. So they start rebalancing their biome and they have a better mental health state. But I thought that works the other way around as well.
Right.
So, and then in medicine, there is a whole direction for medicine. I forget some people, they take the pills to increase your biome, but they manipulate the bacteria to release medication. So it's a medication delivery device.
Right.
And that again raises a lot of questions. So for the andere kant in Holland, I interviewed Jeffrey Smith, who wrote a couple of books on GMOs. And he launched a campaign, I think 1 or 2 years ago. It's called Gene Out of the Bottle. Because he said, we're so concerned about the genetic manipulation of humans or of animals. But he said the real risk is this genetic modification of bacteria where there's no oversight. And if a bacteria is released in the environment and it gets loose, there's really not a good way to control it anymore. So it's very interesting what he has to say about it. So if you talk about what does this do to your body, and I think to your mental state as well, this manipulation of bacteria is very important as well. And in general, I just think the lab-grown meat is extremely toxic. It cannot be differently. And if you eat toxic stuff, you get sick and you won't feel well and you can't think well.
Okay, so one of the things I was going to mention at the beginning, but I'll mention it now, is the European Union has indicated it's asking for a full vote in the Parliament to approve the digital ID. So, the headlines are Europe is going ahead with digital ID. And of course, we know from what the ECB has said, digital ID is condition precedent to financial transaction control, whether it's CBDC or fast payment systems, or there are many different ways they have of doing control. As we watch these announcements coming out of the Netherlands or Europe of bringing up these kind of businesses to do pharma food, we're also watching that control system go in, which could be used to mandate that we have to eat this food. So we just had Italy outlaw using the insect, flour made with insects, but you put in place a financial transaction control system and they can mandate that we all eat this stuff. And that's the only food we get, particularly as they're moving the farmers off the land. So do you think there's a connection between the digital ID and the control system and the fact that they're bringing this stuff up when there's clearly no market for it?
Most definitely. That's like in the end of the report, because so I was reading all these articles and I was just so amazed. Like I was reading the whole time and thinking, this is insane. This is not possible. Who would think of this? And like one time disgust and the other time just surprised and the other time just laughing because it's so over the top. And then at some point I had this turning moment where I thought, under what conditions would this be rational? Because, and then... Sorry.
Well, I wanted to point out that where this is going on, I thought it was interesting. The reason the Netherlands is so important is someone had a patent on a process, and that was out of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands was early on into this, but Israel, and there's a lot of interest in Israel, and other parts of the Middle East where there is more of a difficulty, deserts. And there's also talk of China coming in. China has no role at this point, at least as far as you were reporting. But the prediction is that it will be very attractive to China, and because of problems with growing. I mean, in the United States, we have huge amount of farmland, and we don't have a problem delivering food for the entire population. But there are some countries, and you've got companies like Archer Daniels Midland and Nestle and, the big companies that want to market internationally. Could it be that they have those countries in mind as the source of huge amounts of those countries can't produce meat, perhaps?
I think that's part of it too, but as Catherine said, as part of the control system, you see that it's not just the lab-grown meat, but it's with the insects, with the vertical farms, the lab-grown meat, the precision fermentation that in the US it's sold as animal-free dairy products or animal-free butter or animal-free milk. All these products, they are patented, they are part of large food conglomerates, and they are behind factory doors. So as soon as they get rid of the farmers, and they're really pushing for this in the Netherlands, then these are the parties that are producing our foods. And these are the types of food that they intend to produce. So I do think there's a reason for the countries that you mentioned, that if you don't have access to food, that this is a way for them to think like, this is how we can grow food. But it also means that the people in power, this is the kind of food they want to produce. And it's all GMO on steroids. There is no quality control over it. So that's what you're dependent on then.
So right. You had this section where you talk about why would rational people do this? And I remember one of the things we discussed when we did the first interview on pharma food for the Solari report, when we launched the wrap-up, was we discussed the fact that there's a wonderful website called Suspicious Observers, Ben Davidson, who really believes, along with a lot of other people, that we're going into a solar minimum. And we know in a solar minimum, agricultural output traditionally crashes, or, drops dramatically. And so if you're facing a solar minimum, these are the kinds of things you pour money in to figure out, okay, how can we create a food supply? How can we grow indoors? How can we grow underground? How can we make synthetic meat? I mean, that would be a rational reason, not just why the Middle East would do it, but why the United States would do it if it was worried about a solar minimum. So that was one question we had. Is that a logical explanation? Another explanation you always hear is, how can you, for long spaceship travel, we know Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. How do you carry and create enough food? The Netherlands, I don't know if you know this, it's historically the great extension of the Dutch people was when they figured out how to salt cod, and you could put cod in a barrel and it would be good protein for 10 years. So how do you do the same for 100-year spaceship travel? And so the idea of doing this would, that's another theory. So any other theories on why rational people would do this?
Well, why not so rational people would do this? Because the science into the lab meat is really the same science as is used for regenerative medicine. And regenerative medicine looks at how cells age and how you can keep them alive. And it are really the tech billionaires who are investing in this. They are obsessed with eternal life. So there was one billionaire who said, at some point, it's just not satisfying to buy another yacht. The only question that really matters is can I live longer to enjoy my money? And you see all these tech billionaires investing in this regenerative medicine, and it's not producing enough. And I think even with that amount of money, you cannot buy up all these scientists. And now all this money is pouring into lab meat, and it's getting scientists from the regenerative medicine subject. And they get all this scientific discovery and so they get a lot of free science generated.
Right.
For it appears to be about lab meat, but it could very well be for the regenerative medicine as well.
So that's typical. So, a perfect example is the intelligence agencies used to finance studies on how to improve and help memory, that they were really planning on using the material to do mind control. But they couldn't get the scientists to do the work if the scientists knew what it was really about. So they would have, here's the mission, go and, figure this out. And they would have another use for it that was covert. So,
the question is,
go ahead.
So the question is senescence, like why do cells die? Like cells proliferate and at some point they start dying off. And that's the key question for the regenerative medicine. How do you keep your cells alive? But it's also the key question for the lab-grown meat, because otherwise you cannot grow those cells. It's a very basic question.
It's quite remarkable because in one line of study, you're figuring out how the billionaires can live forever and how you can depopulate the rest of the population so that they don't. Right? It's a twofer. Right, it's a twofer.
Well, one of the things I learned at the Weston Price conference, there's such an emphasis on veganism and vegetarianism, and the media, or what we all think is, I guess vegetables are more healthy than meat is. And the people who were doing presentations at Weston Price said, we need meat and fat, and that plant diets, we're not intended as humans. We need meat, and we don't digest vegetables, and we don't digest plants easily, and you have to kind of do some things to them. I mean, they're good for washing through your system and cleaning it out, but in terms of nutrition, there are some things that are lacking, and they were suggesting that perhaps people who were vegetarian and vegan might not end up living as long. So under that theory, maybe there's an intent to deprive us of the meat that we need nutritionally in order to thrive. Because is there any evidence as healthy as meat?
Sorry?
Is there any evidence that this is as healthy as meat?
No.
There's a lot of evidence that it's not healthy at all.
Right.
So it's just because we like to eat meat.
So let me turn. Well, it looks to me like a prototype. Somebody's trying to figure out how they can use this to feed people. So if you look at the American diet, for example, from from World War II on, you just kept adding more and more calories with sugar, and the nutrition went down, but people got the same or more calories, just a lot less nutrition. And this looks like the same kind of process on steroids is what it appears to be. Now let me turn. There's a wonderful farm in Vermont that many of us love called Meadow Bee Farm. And they have a book club. And interestingly enough, it was just totally by accident that I discovered their book club is doing pharma food this month. They're reading pharma food and discussing it. And as I told you, some of my favorite people in the regenerative farming and healthy local fresh farm, I thought they would hate pharma food. I just felt we had to do it, and you were willing to do it. And people needed to know how bad this was. Well, they're using it to market, and it's working. So they've totally embraced it, to my shock and amazement. I was completely wrong about this. And, Carolyn, when we were at Weston Price and CHD, we saw that. So anyway, they're doing pharma food, and I asked them to send us their questions so we could put some of the questions, and they sent us a list of many great questions, which unfortunately we don't have the time to do, but I shared them with you. And I wanted to see if we could address some of the ones that pertain to Europe. So I thought maybe we'd start with labeling. They had some great labeling questions. So why don't you dive in and take the lead here?
So they asked why the EU labeling is better, but it's actually not better at all. So we have slightly more strict GMO legislation, but there's a very strong lobby to get rid of it. And so, for example, for the regular GMOs, it's still you can get it on the market, but it's difficult, and that's because we have so many different EU countries with different food lobbies. But now you have this gene editing where they say, well, this is not traditional GMO. This could hypothetically also happen spontaneously in nature, so that's why we shouldn't regulate it. And the European Commission. Yeah, so gene editing is CRISPR, TALENT. It's a whole. So with gene editing, instead of inserting a foreign gene, they say they precisely cut the genome, and then it repairs, and you get a different trait, and that's somehow better. But they try to deregulate this, and this will be completely unlabeled, and then we will be in a worse situation than in the US, because in the US you have the non-GMO project. But here, because there's no labeling, also for the organic producers, the organic seed producers, there's no way to know anymore if something is gene edited or not. Right. So that is a big risk. And then what I discovered, the precision fermentation, I was interested, is this already in the EU market? Because that would fall under the GMO policy, you would expect. And it was quite an effort, but finally I discovered that the precision fermentation, they consider the GMO bacterium is a processing agent, but the product that the GMO bacteria produces is not a GMO. So this is not part of the GMO legislation. And it's all being approved as novel food. And novel food is anything that we didn't recognize as food before 1999. So this is like nanotech, but the bacteria, like the weird stuff, insects, that's also a novel food. And so all these precision fermented products, they are approved under the novel food policy. And I asked, can you give me a list of the precision fermented product? And then they say, no, we use another name. And I said, well, we don't have a list of this. So what you have to do is you, from the scientific literature, you know the kind of bacteria that they use. And then I was searching for the bacteria, and then you find, because they use that as a processing agent, and then you can find these type of products. But I have no idea. So they are already using these as food ingredients, and also for animal food, again, talking about the microbiome, and it's being approved and not labeled. So I wouldn't say that the situation in the EU is that much better. So again, if you want to have safe food, I would go to your farmer. The farmers that are still there, that are growing it, talk to your farmer, talk to farmers that have cows, how they treat their cows. Then you know what they put in your food or not.
The only way I think you know that food is safe is if you proactively do diligence and have relationships. So yes. You have to have a proactive relationship with the source of the food, and you need to make sure. You know, we haven't talked about mRNA vaccines, but one of the things I learned from Will Harris, who runs one of the popular regenerative farms in America, is now at the farmers market, everybody is saying our beef is raised without mRNA vaccines. We don't use mRNA vaccines, or we don't use vaccines. You know, and that's part of this proactive marketing to say, no, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do this. But without that due diligence, I mean, driving around the country is frightening, because you have no idea what, you know, you can't tell what's food and what's poison in many instances.
So in the United States, it is not required to label, for example, meat, whether mRNA has been used in the growing of the cattle, of the animals.
Right. Right.
So in the Netherlands and the EU also it isn't. So they approved the medicines, and there are mRNA medicines are among those. Yes.
Right. I'll never forget, Robin O'Brien is a wonderful person sort of in the food area in the United States. And she was an equity analyst. And when she was an equity analyst, she thought all the organic food stuff was just a complete waste of money and people being, you know, picky and ridiculous. And then she had kids, and all her kids started getting chronically ill. And so she did a deep dive on the food and realized, starting in 1996, the food had just kept deteriorating and deteriorating and deteriorating. It's part of what I call the great poisoning. And she realized, oh my God, you do have to be super picky and careful, and that was just from GMOs and too much sugar and processed food. Now what we're talking about is something on steroids that I think can absolutely kill you and kill your kids. So it's and to say that it's time consuming to discover your local fresh food systems and figure out how to access local fresh food, but it's a market, and it's clearly, ever since the pandemic started, it's growing. Well, why don't we turn it for a second, and because at the same time you were writing Pharma Food, you were writing a second blockbuster called The Dutch Farmers and Fishermen. And one of the, there's a lot of interest around the world in what's been happening with the Dutch farmers and fishermen, because they are, the Netherlands is in a process of sort of moving the farmers and fishermen out of their business, or making their business uneconomic. And anyway, I felt it was essential that people not only understand what was happening to the farmers and fishermen, but how it related to the whole control system, how it related to the World Health Organization, how it related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and One Health, how it related to financial transaction control, the whole control grid. Where did the Dutch farmers and fishermen sit in the middle of the control grid? So maybe you could and we've published your piece on Dutch farmers and fishermen, and I'm very excited to announce it's now out in Dutch as well, because you
Yes.
did it in English, and then we got it translated back into Dutch, so it's out now. But tell us a little bit about the Dutch farmer and fisherman sort of blockbuster that you've written and how it fits in with Pharma Food.
Well, Pharma Food is the biotech takeover of the food system. And the farmers and fishermen is really the agribusiness takeover. And for the Dutch farmers and fishermen, I dove into the history, because in the argument, the narrative in the Netherlands is that the Dutch farmers are bad for nature. And I thought that's so weird, because farmer is the oldest profession, one of the oldest professions that there is. How can it be bad for nature? So I thought it's really industrial agriculture that's bad for nature. And where did that originate? So that was kind of my research question. And then I discovered the origins of the industrial agriculture, which was actually pre-World War II. It was a lot of Rockefeller Institute experiments. And then after the Second World War, the US government, they made it part of their foreign policy that they wanted to control the global food system by implementing industrial agriculture. So what does industrial agriculture do? It changes your business model. Before, the farmer's business model is completely autonomous. You have your piece of land and you generate everything you need and have from your piece of land. And after that, it was all pulled apart. So you had bigger pieces of land, but to have that, you need to go into depth. So there's a debt trap model. And then to produce your stuff, you need all these external inputs, the seeds, the fertilizer, the pesticides. And you see then you get the global agribusiness corporations that dominate the global food markets. And it makes all those farmers, you get fewer farmers. There's fewer people working on the land. There's fewer people who own land. And there's enormous urbanization push. And you see this policy was implemented as the Green Revolution in the Global South, and with Marshall Aid money in Western Europe. And of course, this Green Revolution happened in the US as well. So that's the big, and so there were three results from industrial agriculture. It's destruction of nature, it's urbanization, it's the rise of global agribusiness. And then in the 1976, the UN says, well, this is causing a problem, this rapid urbanization, and there's a lot of environmental damage. We need to deal with this. And they call out the Habitat I conference. And they say, we need policy for human settlements. But then, you know what? we need to control the land. But if we need to control the land, private ownership is a big issue. So we need to bring private land under public control. So if you're wondering why you cannot grow certain kind of plants on your soil, or you cannot build a shed, or you need to use certain types of paints to paint your house, or all these, this is all part of this public control over your private property. And that was really the legal basis for the Agenda 21 that was launched in 1992. Because what did it say? So instead of just directly taking land from people, you do it through administrative controls, and they decide based on those controls where people can live and where they cannot live. And you get two branches. So you get policy for urbanizations, which goes into smart cities and 15-minute zones, like open air prisons. And you get the bioreserve. In the Netherlands, it's called Natura. In the US, it's wildlands. But worldwide, they are creating these nature protected areas that are off limits for people under under surveillance of NGOs, basically. So that was the big, and so fast forward what's happening to the Netherlands. So they created all these kind of like wildlands reserves. In the Netherlands, it's called Natura 2000. And they say, well, if there's too much nitrogen near these reserves, some plants will not grow. And that's why the farmers need to go. We have a nitrogen problem. And this is serious. I'm not joking about this. That's right. why the farm, but so they want to, so in 1945, we had 410,000 farmers. We have about 50,000, 51,000 now. They say now they need to go, 5,000 at least need to go, that they want to buy them out. But if you look at the government policy that has been set in motion by the latest government that fell, the cabinet, they are planning something, it's called the big remodeling, which is kind of, so they say there is a nature transition, we need an agricultural transition, we need an energy transition, we need a mobility transition, we need an urban transition, we need more space for the military. And to do this, we need to divide up the country again. I'm citing the policy documents right now. So if you look what they want to do with the transitions, really the nitrogen issue is just a very small stepping stone. They want to remodel the whole right. country. And if you see what they want to do, so the EU has also adopted the intention to install 30,000 wind turbines in the North Sea. So it's not just in the Dutch part. There right. won't be fishermen anymore. Yeah.
So I live in a sailing community in Friesland. And so we've been watching the wind turbines come up in what used to be the fishing, areas. So now the fishermen can't fish in those areas. They're making it impossible for the fishermen to fish. They're changing the economics. And it's a lot of what I call the 26-step process. Oh, you need this engine, and now you need to do this, and now you need to do that. And I think one of the things you point out is some of the innovations they've stopped that would make fishing economic. Mm-hmm. So they're steadily making fishing uneconomic, but the areas that were used for fishing, they're bringing up wind turbines, which are basically providing electricity to Bill Gates's data centers in the control grid. So yes, instead of having fish, we have control. We have electricity for a control grid. And if you look at mm-hmm. what they're doing and the environmental damage it's causing, it's certifiably insane. I mean, you would only do this if all you cared about was total central control. It's what it looks like to me.
Yeah, well, definitely. So if you do wildlands vision, they want to get rid of civilization, basically. And if you see what they do with their policy and blowing up the electricity grid, and electricity for control, but also so getting rid of the real food producers, it's control, but it's also destroying civilization, basically setting us back a couple of. So in Germany, there are people who are stopping their energy contracts because they cannot afford paying their electricity bills anymore. They call this energy poverty. So
Right.
Germany is an industry juggernaut, and they have a shrinking economy. That's what the policy does.
Well, it's funny, when I first started talking the wind turbines to my neighbors, they would say, "Oh, we're doing it so we're not dependent on Russian gas." And now slowly they're realizing, oh, this is all about central control. It's just totally
Yes.
okay. So we there are a lot of great questions from the Meadow Bee farm people, and I'm gonna try and figure out how we get more of them answered. But I want to turn one set of questions was on the sort of the legislation that's happening in the United States. So I want to turn to our term of the day. But before I do, I want to mention again, Pete Kennedy wrote a great piece on, how to find and create relationships in your local food system. It's in Pharma Food, and I recommend it because we put it in, even though it made it even longer, because we realized after they read Pharma Food, everybody's going to get very serious about finding their local food. So I would encourage you to read that piece. But clearly there's legislative issues in the United States. So can we turn now to our term of the day? Carolyn, you want to introduce it?
Yes, we were trying to think of a term that would relate to pharma food. And I said, what about the Prime Act? Now, the Prime Act is something that's been introduced either 4 or 5 times in Congress and has not passed. But it was introduced again this year. And Thomas Massie, who's a Republican from Kentucky, and a Democrat, I don't have it on the screen, but it's a bipartisan bill. And if you want to encourage your congressperson or your senator to vote for this, what you do is see if they're Democrat or Republican, and then mention one of the whichever of the co-sponsors is of the same party. So, basically, the problem with meat production now, there are lines for getting meat processed, slaughtered in the United States that are 6 months or a year out for small farmers. And the requirement is that they get it inspected at a USDA approved facility, which might be 100 miles away. So this makes it very, very expensive for local farmers. And so the Prime Act would allow small farmers to have a substitute method using private inspectors to inspect their meat so that it actually will increase the amount of meat that can come out of small farms and make it cheaper for the farmer, because the farmer doesn't have to drive dozens, if not hundreds of miles in order to get the meat slaughtered and then wait in line for 6 months. So this has been something, as I said, they've introduced it 4 or 5 times, and I think this is the 4th time. But we very much encourage you to get in touch with your representatives and encourage them to do this so that we can make meat much more affordable and available.
One of the things, we had this wonderful event in Rogersville, Tennessee, with Senator Frank Nicely and Bud Halsey, who've done a lot for food freedom. And they're the people who got ivermectin made legal over the counter in Tennessee. It's the only state in the country where but they've done, they call it running bills. They've run bills for food and health freedom and financial transaction freedom. They're doing incredible things. And one of the things they described is how when they had a bill like the Prime Act, obviously Prime is at the federal level, but, people did not call their representatives and get them to come on board. And so it doesn't take but a quick call, or, usually through their websites, you can send an email. It's really powerful if you can send a handwritten letter. But anything you can do to really get your, now it's the Democrat is from Maine. It's, the name
Right.
is on the screen. Carolyn, what's the name of the Democrat?
Well, the new system is such that I can't read it.
Oh, you can't read it? I think it's Pingree, something
Yes.
like that. Pingree.
Yes,
Shelley
Shelley.
Pingree. Shelley Pingree, from a Democrat from Maine. in the House. So, and Maine is the state that passed the Right to Food Act. So Maine has been quite good on food freedom. Anyway, anything you can do to make sure your representative supports the Prime Act, that would be very, very, very helpful. Okay, so let's turn, Elsa, I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for these two studies. It's extraordinary research. It's extraordinary synthesis of so many different issues across sectors. It was, to me, it's exceptionally important that the farmers and the fishermen in the Netherlands understand how they fit into the big picture. And they understand why, all the different forces are arrayed and how the sort of all the lies work. And I really am very excited about this coming out in Dutch so that all the farmers and fishermen can access and read it. So tell us a little bit before we close on what we can do over the, if people are listening, what can they do to support you, to support your work, and to support this message getting out to the farmers and fishermen who are on the front line, both in the Netherlands, all across Europe, all across America, fighting this incredible headwinds?
So you can follow me on my website, www.vanhamelen.eu. And how you can support the farmers, I think there are three ways. One is as a consumer, vote with your dollars. Don't spend your dollars at supermarkets or at the big supermarket chain or the brands, but really buy directly from farmers if you can, or buy through an intermediary. So in the Netherlands, we have a lot of people who buy from the local farmers, and then you can order on their website and you get your fresh produce just delivered to your house. And if that's not in your neighborhood, that's a great idea for a startup. But it also really helps to just talk with your farmers about what their challenges are, how you can help them. Then there's a part as an investor. Anyone who still has money to invest, really buy a piece of land or support your farmers with investments so that they get out of this debt model. I think we should start developing investment funds to do this, and also to help industrial farmers to make the transition. And I think as a civilian, support the people who represent you. Like in politics, we really need to shift the discussion. So in the Netherlands, the discussions are about climate, about nature. And what we're really saying here, we launched a campaign here in the Netherlands, is no, we don't need to talk about nature and climate change. We need to talk about property rights, about food security, and about freedom of entrepreneurship. And those are the key topics that we need to start discussing. And so really, we need to shift debates. And even if a debate sounds kind of, it's just words, but the biggest changes come from a change in ideas. And what I notice in new media is that they say, well, there's a nitrogen problem. And then as a new media, we jump onto it and we say, well, no, there's this issue with this model. And here's this scientist that contests the model. And we're still having the debate on their territory, but we need to shift the debate to a different level. And I hope my reports and reading my reports will help you do that.
Right. I think they do. I tell you, Pharma Food, when you read it, first of all, I tell people if you're on a diet, it'll help. But the second thing is, if you're not serious about fresh food, after you read Pharma Food, you will get very, very serious about fresh food. So anyway, Carolyn, any other closing thoughts? You and I were talking earlier today about the Great Poisoning, and I will just lay it out on the table because I was very passionate in talking to Carolyn about how we stop food transaction freedom. As I said, it's very important to understand, I think the number one cause of suppressing family income, suppressing family wealth, bankrupting families is the Great Poisoning, which is bad food, bad pharmaceuticals, and they're, money and health is one thing. If we don't eat healthy nutrition, we're not going to be healthy, and that's going to have a dramatic impact on our financial wealth. And so I see this issue as absolutely essential to building family wealth. You cannot build family wealth unless you're getting great nutrition. So to me, there's no more important financial question than how we help our families avoid sort of getting slaughtered in the great poisoning. Anyway, Carolyn, any other thoughts?
Yes, I'm going to say, do as I do, not just as I say. I'm going to visit my farmer tomorrow. I now have a personal farmer, and it's a woman. She's about half an hour, 35-minute drive from the city.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank her for all of us. I was at Churchtown Dairy this weekend. The best raw milk I've ever had. It's so amazing. So you absolutely, you want to go get that raw milk. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Financial Rebellion. Carolyn and I will look forward to our Thanksgiving show next week.
Right.